another opportunity to meet as your church and to learn more from your word about the heroes of faith, those that we really look up to. And we're reminded, though, Lord, that they're just regular men and women just like us, that, yes, they did extraordinary things, but through you, Lord. And we pray that this morning we'd be encouraged as we look into Moses. And then we're looking forward to worshiping you in the next hour, and pray that worship would be pleasing to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, fine sir. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see your faces. You know, as somebody asked me if I was a teacher this morning, I said, no, I'm the talker. There's a lot of folks in this room I can't really teach anything to. So we're going to talk for the next few minutes, about 40 minutes. We're just going to discuss Moses. A little bit about his life, a lot more about his faith, but try to figure out a little more about who Moses was. Why is he relevant to us? Why do we really care? So let's talk Moses and discover a little more about this character. In the Bible, Moses, other than Jesus, is probably one of the most influential and popular characters. He's mentioned multiple times throughout the Bible, and his achievements, you could even say, are greater than so many more. But other than Jesus, Moses is the guy. But why is he the guy? I want to first talk a little bit about Moses and his life, because that has relevance to his faith. As you read about Moses, I'll be honest, I had skimmed over Moses for years, frankly. I mean, I always think when I think of Moses, I think of some of the movies that have been put out, where he has the 2 Ten Commandment tablets and he's on the mountain, and it's all powerful, and there's lightning and fire and all kinds of crazy things going on around him. That's what I always think about Moses. Or I think about Moses with his staff, and he's out there parting the Red Sea and all the great things that he did. But I never really thought about Moses as that guy who makes mistakes, that guy who fumbles on himself, that guy who just says some foolish things sometimes. I never really thought of him like that. But Moses is a multifaceted kind of guy. Moses was born a Hebrew. He was born in Egypt. He was born into slavery. It was when the Israelites were under the Pharaoh's control, and that's the life he knew as a young boy. But when he was born, this is where the faith piece comes in, because God had a role. I mean, God has a role in all of our lives, right? But God had a role in the Scriptures in his birth all the way through his death, and you can see a direct role and influence that God had. Well, his parents knew that Moses was a special baby. They knew something was just different about this kiddo. Not different bad, different good. And for 3 months, Mom hid Moses. Now, why did Mom hide Moses? Well, at the time, the Israelites were the main working force in Egypt. And there were so many Israelites that the Pharaoh was nervous. Because really, if the Israelites would have risen up against the Egyptians, maybe they would have been out of captivity earlier. But there were so many, they were afraid that something bad was going to happen if the Israelites decided to make it happen. So therefore, the Pharaoh said, boy babies got to die. So Mom hid Moses. 3 months goes by, she can't hide Moses anymore. So at that point, she goes and she builds a raft. I mean, in the movies, it's always like weaving a little raft and different things. But she builds a little boat, and she puts Moses in the Nile and pushes him out there. Now, coincidentally, the Pharaoh's daughter is down by the Nile at that point, and she happens to see Moses in the little, or at least a little baby, right? A little cry. I'm assuming, crying little baby or making some sort of noise, cooing or something. But baby in this little raft, out in the water, on the edge of the water, and the Pharaoh's daughter takes Moses from the river and wants to raise Moses as her own. But Pharaoh's daughter hasn't had a baby, so there's no way to feed. She can't nurse Moses. So she hires a Hebrew woman. Enter stage right, Moses' mom. Way to go, Mom. Not only does Mom hide the baby, figure out he's special. When she can't hide him, she puts him in the raft, makes it to where Pharaoh's daughter finds him, and now she continues to get to be with her baby because she's wet nurse for Moses in the palace. Way to go, Mom. Moms are always thinking like that. Interestingly enough, Moses becomes a murderer. Moses at heart was always a Hebrew. He was never an Egyptian. Even though he was being raised as royalty, trying to skip that one, even though he was being raised as royalty and Pharaoh, and after he was no longer being nursed by his mom, Pharaoh's daughter raised him and educated him just like any other royal in the palace. But one day he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. So in Exodus 2:2, nope, not Exodus 2:2, I'll lead you astray there. By the way, we're going to be dealing mostly in Exodus and Deuteronomy. That book, Deuteronomy, it's a rough one today, so if you want to earmark those, you can. But in Exodus 2:12, it talks about Moses. It says, looking this way and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. But Moses wasn't very good of a cover-up because the next day he got called out by a Hebrew slave. And in Exodus 1:13-14, the next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? And you thinking of me or killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." I got enough sleep last night, but today I can't read. Boy, this is rough. So Moses became a murderer. So what happens? He becomes afraid. So what do murderers usually do when they get afraid? They run, right? So Moses runs. He leaves the comforts of the palace. He leaves the comforts of his adopted mom, Pharaoh's daughter, and he runs. He runs out to the desert, and he lives there for 40 years. Now, he lives there that's a long time in the desert. I go to the Boise Desert for 4 hours, and I'm ready to come back. But he lives out in the desert for 40 years. While he's there, he gets married. He has a couple kids. So he creates a life for himself out in the desert, gone from all the creature comforts. Those days you could disappear. Now it's a little bit harder. But fear showed up again in Exodus 3:2 when God, and we'll talk about some of these things in a little more detail here in a few minutes when we're talking about faith, but I'm just trying to give you a background. Fear showed up again when God spoke to him through a burning bush. Now, I don't know about you guys, if you guys were, but for me, if I was walking along or if I was tending sheep or any of those kind of things and there was a burning bush that wasn't being consumed, that would kind of freak me out a little bit. Well, so Moses, just like everyone else, becomes fearful. Moses, just like everyone else, is human. He has hopes, joys, fears, like all of us. Well, he gets afraid. And then later we'll talk a little more about the burning bush. Again, fear. There's a common theme here, fear. God wanted Moses to rescue the Israelites from Egypt. Moses was afraid and gave excuses to God of why he wasn't that guy. He even said because he stutters, he's not that guy. And he said, please send someone else. Not me. Send somebody else. I'm not that guy. God didn't want to send somebody else and got angry with Moses. And you'll see God getting angry with Moses a few different times. He didn't ever smite Moses. He didn't ever take him out. Moses never just disappeared in the night. But not only was Moses human and became afraid, not only was Moses human and he did things that angered God, but God continually had patience with Moses. However, Moses was a courageous leader. Moses didn't see himself as a leader. He sold himself short. He didn't want to be the leader of his nation, but sometimes too bad, so sad. God said, Moses, you're going to be the leader of your nation. You're the man. So guess what? He did. Moses became the leader of his nation. But God recruited Aaron. Who was Aaron? There you go. He was Moses' brother. He was eloquent. Could speak clearly, speak smoothly. Unlike me this morning, words rolled right off of his tongue. He was respected. So he was Moses' mouthpiece. God recruited Aaron to help him out. Moses rose to the challenge, though, of being the leader. And although the Israelites kind of seemed, everybody's adults here. Okay, the Israelites almost seemed like junior high kids to me. It's like every time you give them something, it isn't quite good enough. Every time you give them something, they always want a little more. They never look and say, well, I'm happy with what I have. Oh, look at the great gifts God has given us. No, it's always a little more, a little more, a little more. And they blame Moses for most things. So maybe Moses not want to be their leader, not only because he didn't want to be out there in the forefront, but maybe he just didn't want to lead these people for all the problems he would put up with. But I digress. Moses also, his acts of leadership, you'll see like in the parting of the Red Sea. He led the people. He's under immense pressure from not only the Israelites to take care of them, but the Pharaoh's army is also chasing him. And then God gives certain commands, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about Moses' faith. Tells Moses to do certain things. The people are kind of wary. Are you sure? Are you sure? And Moses again says, this is what we have to do. Let's go do it. And he leads the people through, saves the people. Army is destroyed. But do you think again the Israelites complained? Shake your head up and down. Yes, Israelites complained. But again, Moses is a great leader. Moses was close to God. And it's really interesting to look at the relationship between Moses and God. Because it's almost like this friend relationship. With so many Bible characters, it's definitely God is here and the character is here. And the only time they come close to each other is when that character is praying, asking for. But it seems like Moses, it's this different relationship between God and Moses. And I don't want to get into my future slides, but it's like almost like a friendship. It's a working connection, a cooperative agreement. It's obvious Moses is subservient to God, and he sees it that way. But the way that they talk to each other at times, the patience that God has with Moses and the people, and the influence that Moses has over some of God's decisions is rather interesting and encouraging because that relationship isn't seen in most places. If I don't go through some of my notes, then we're going to end like halfway through today. So, and then the scriptures talk about Moses was buried by God. I don't know exactly what that means. Now, I know that if any one of us were to die out in the desert or on a mountaintop in the woods, if there's sand and the wind blows, it's going to cover us over. Over time, a mudslide, it's going to cover our bodies over. If there's rock slide and fall, it's going to cover our bodies over. So exactly what that means, that God buried Moses, I don't know. Other than Moses died at about a 120-year-old man, and at that point, God disposed of Moses' body. Why did God dispose of Moses' body? God disposed of Moses' body because if the Israelites knew where Moses had died, it would become like a shrine. They would worship that area. They would worship the death place of Moses, and that's not at all what God wanted, Moses wanted, and that would have been bad for the Israelites. So God buried Moses, and where that exact location is even today, they don't know. Other than the mountaintop, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So now that we know a little more about Moses, let's delve deeper into his faith. So one example of his enormous faith is the burning bush. We touched on that a little bit. We talked about Moses. He went to the wilderness, or he went out in the desert, for 40 years. right? He got married. One day he's out. He's tending to the flock, his father-in-law's flock. And imagine, you got your sheep herder. Sheep are doing their thing. They're, they'll stay fairly close to you. They'll stay in a fairly good group. And he's just watching them. And then there's a bush. I know I'm oversimplifying this story, but the burning bush it's a sermon all by itself. So, but he sees this burning bush. So what does he do? What's he do when he sees the burning bush? Huh? Yeah, like any curious person, right? You go look at it, and what does he see? A bush that burns that isn't burned up. Now, I picture sagebrush. Anybody ever seen a range fire? Okay, sagebrush. Range fires move pretty quickly. You get to this big piece of sagebrush, big ones. And what happens to sagebrush in seconds? Poof, it's gone. It's gone. Just boom, it's gone. And it moves on to the next piece. There's just some charred pieces of trunk and everything else that sit and smolder and burn for a while, then it's gone. But you see a bush, whether it's a juniper or it's a sagebrush or whatever, and it's burning, it's fully engulfed in flame, but it's not going away. Now, would that make you wonder a little more? Would you become a little more inquisitive? I mean, I'm not a real bright guy. I'm the kind of guy I'd probably hang out a little longer to check it out. I wouldn't really run away right out of the chute. Maybe I should, I don't know. But I'd check it out some more. So what happens? He sees the burning bush, it's not being consumed. Then what? What's that?
Hears the voice.
And what does the voice say? That's right. Take off your shoes. You're on holy ground. Now this should have given Moses a clue. Something else was going on here. So what does Moses do? He takes off his shoes. He's on holy ground. And this starts a conversation. But the faith, this is one step for Moses towards a greater faith. Because Moses, when you read about Moses in the Bible, I see a character that wants to be faithful. A character that really believes that God has this power. He believes that God is the all-knowing, but he has this problem with execution. He has this problem of really just putting it all out there and letting God sort it out. He has a problem with just the blind faith. He's got to see something. So burning bush, I mean, that's a pretty good thing to see. That's a pretty good indicator, right? That something more is happening out there. So he takes off his shoes because he's on holy ground. So that's one example of the growth of Moses' faith. Let's flip over to Exodus 4:1. Is there somebody who'd like to read? It's kind of long, but it's 18 verses. I know it sounds horribly long, so there's whole chapters that are less than that, but it's a real short read. Somebody read Exodus 4:1 through 18? But not all at once. Bueller. Oh, we got the microphone. That's right. We're supposed to use the microphone during this. Now I really need a volunteer because we have a mic to give you. Excellent. Thank you, sir. 4:1 through 18.
Exodus 4:1 through 18. Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. "This," said the Lord, "is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Then the Lord said, "Put your hand inside your cloak." So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was leprous like snow. "Now put it back into your cloak," he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored, like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, if they do not believe you or pay attention to the first miraculous sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these two signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it onto the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. The Lord said to him, who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. But Moses said, O Lord, please send someone else to do it. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you.
It takes a burning bush to make, thank you very much, to make Moses listen up. I referenced that dialogue. Moses listens up. There's a dialogue between Moses and God here. God says, you need to go down and talk to Pharaoh and get your people out of captivity. And he says, what? No. I ain't the guy, boss. I'm not the guy. He says, no, yeah, you are. Oh, by the way, because you think you're not the guy, we're going to send Aaron with you. He can speak for you. So it takes that. Yes, sir.
What would you do? I would be speechless. That guy's not burning and he's in the middle of the bush.
Yeah, I might have been creating more distance between me and the bush and angel this whole conversation. And each time I say something and the angel comes back or God speaks to the angel and says, no. I may have been looking for a way to kind of exit the area as this conversation continues. Yeah, because forest fire's coming, that's for sure. So Moses' faith is established, but even with the burning bush and the angel and the dialogue, you can see he still resists. He still pushes back. He does it, but he still pushes back. But only it seems like only when God says, "Okay, you got Aaron, you got the man," and does he say, "Okay, I understand." So he comes out of the desert because at this point, all the people that, for the most part, that wanted to kill him because he was a murderer, looking for him. It's 40 years later. Statute of limitations, I guess, is expired. So he comes down out of the desert, and he asks Pharaoh to free his people. Now, this has got to take some guts, too, and it's got to take some faith in God, because this is a guy who Pharaoh knew. This is a guy that had a relationship with Pharaoh, and so there's some vulnerabilities there. But Moses had actually murdered somebody 40 years before, and Pharaoh is still alive to say, aha, you're that guy. And Pharaoh tried to kill him once before after he murdered the Egyptian, right? And so what's to say that Pharaoh isn't going to try again? So coming to Pharaoh out of the desert takes a little bit of moxie, I guess you could say. The word probably hasn't been used for the 1940s, sorry. I said it the other day at work, and this 25-year-old kid just looked at me and shook his head and kind of smiled. And I said, you don't know what I'm talking about, do you? He said, no. So, it's a regular thing for me at work. So he comes down, he says, Pharaoh, I need you, I'll say, let my people go. That's not really what he said. But in the movie, it says, let my people go. And what does Pharaoh say? Ain't going to do it. That's right. Pharaoh says, ain't going to do it. And he says ain't going to do it because that's his workforce. If he lets the Israelites go, who does he have to do the hard labor in Egypt? Right? That's his workforce. So he's got to keep them. He can't let this mass amount of people go, not only his workforce, but to potentially create an army and stand up against them. Yes, sir. That's right, exactly. He doesn't have power and rule over the kingdom at that point. He just has power and rule over that portion. And so he can't let the Israelites go. So after he says, no way, then God does what? Look, there's a cheat part right up there on the slide. Not only does he say, hey, increase the workload on the Israelites, work them harder, but, yes, ma'am.
But for somebody to come down and say, you have to let them go, that's, I think, where he's like, wait a minute, I'm king. You can't tell me what to do because he's not willing to accept God is king.
I think it's exceptionally valid. I think you've got a great point. Because if somebody comes and says, hey, king, you must do this, and he says, okay, well, now what's to stop everybody else from coming in and saying, hey, king, you need to do this, or I'm going to do this, and then pretty soon that rule he has starts to dissolve and get weaker. So, yeah, I think that's a very valid point. She's right. She basically said, somebody who comes in and tells the king, and then the king just does it, well, now, where's that power? So thank you very much for that. So as it was put, the Israelites just won't die. They're still there. There's a lot of them. Pharaoh doesn't want to get rid of them. He says, no, I'm not going to let your people go for a multitude of reasons. So then God sends 10 plagues, some much nastier than others. You know, whether it's water turning to blood. And I've read all kinds of... I'm kind of a National Geographic geek. Not that geek isn't a bad word. I don't look at geek as a bad word. Matter of fact, when it comes to conversations and overall intelligence, geeks win every time. But there's all kinds of ways that scientists have tried to explain the water turning to blood, whether it's an algae bloom or what have you, or the locusts, all these different plagues, explain it away through science, and perhaps some of the scientific methods could be correct. I don't know. However, timing was perfect. If it was an algae bloom, so be it. Timing was perfect. But what I do believe is that God had a hand in making all these 10 plagues fall on Egypt. And if it's people getting boils, or lice infestations, or your animals dying because of diseases and viruses and bacteria, and hail and darkness, and all these heckin' horrible things that would slowly drive a person insane, it happened. And there's scientific proof to show that a lot of these things absolutely did happen in Egypt during this time frame. So, when it comes to the last one was the death of the firstborn, right? When it comes to the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh says, we're done. You're out of here. Go. And what do the Israelites do? They pack up and they get going when the going's good. However, Pharaoh has a change of heart. This is the movie picture up there, standing. I don't know if that really happened that way, but we'll say it did, for dramatic effect. But Pharaoh has a change of heart, and what does he do? A short time later, he sends his army after the Israelites. The Israelites, God commands them. Again, Moses has to have faith, because the thing that so many people would do is run, continue to run, continue to run, continue to run. But Moses doesn't do that. God says, camp. So the Israelites camp. They camp on the shore of what sea? Red Sea. I was going to say every little kindergarten class knows this one. Red Sea, party in the Red Sea. So they camp on the shore of the Red Sea. And then God tells Moses, raise your staff. And again, I'm simplifying these stories, I know. Raise your staff and the waters will part. And it says that even the ground was dry. And so the Israelites were able to cross through the Red Sea while they're being pursued by the army. Then what happens when the army enters the Red Sea? Moses raises his staff and boom, water falls in him and they drown. So then what does Pharaoh do? It's kind of a trick question. Pharaoh does nothing. He's just like, okay, you're out. We're done. I'm done with you. It took that for Pharaoh to say goodbye. But the faith that Moses had to show, because do you think the Israelites, again, they're their junior high kid, do you think the Israelites, before they entered the party in the Red Sea, were saying, oh, Moses, you're so amazing. This is so smart of you. Oh, God, thank you very much. What a way out. Do you think they were doing that? No, it was a grumble. Dad, when are we going to get there? Are we there yet? No, it was a grumble and complain and blame. And so they go through the Red Sea. They get to the other side. They're saved. They're safe. And then what happens? What's that? They do. They praise God and sing a song. And then it's short-lived. Because then life becomes harder again, right? So they wander. And they wander for how long? 40 years. Yeah, I should know that. They wander for 40 years. I started questioning myself. I said 40 days. And I thought, no, it's not 40 days. And I confused myself. It's 40 years. 40 days, they might have actually been okay. But 40 years, they wander. So now, again, this is Moses' fault. And we would have been better off working for the Egyptians. Why are we out here in the desert, wandering for 40 years? Well, they don't take into account, Moses, his faith is growing. Each time one of these things happen, his faith grows more and more and more. Does his people's faith grow more and more and more? No. It's like the junior high kid. No. Yeah, I know you gave me that, but what about now? Well, I know that God kept us safe in Egypt. Even though we were slaves, we were released. I know that we witnessed the 10 plagues. I know that we witnessed and we crossed through the Red Sea. I know that each time, well, Moses, it's your fault. God, why are you doing this over and over and over and over again? So now they're wandering for 40 days and 40 nights. Get all my stories confused. Wandering for 40 years in the desert. And they're supposed to go to the promised land, correct? Okay, it's going to take some little time to get there. But now, Moses' faith is tested again. So what's the significance of Mount Sinai? What's that? I'm sorry. The law, the commandments. Okay, so again, oversimplifying the story, because this is like a whole series of sermons just on this portion of this whole story by itself. But they're at the base of Mount Sinai. Moses goes up to the mountain. And what does he do on the mountain? It's over in Exodus 20. Or excuse me, Exodus 19. Now, the way the scripture describes it, it had to be scary. Because this is like movie stuff. I mean, this is like hellfire and brimstone type stuff. I mean, there's smoke, there's fire, there's chaos. I mean, to me, I see it in my head when I'm reading the scripture, reading chapter 19, almost like a battle scene. I mean, you find pictures that artists have done on the internet, and it's a mountaintop with some people standing looking around it, and there's a little lightning and a little smoke. No. I think it was like lightning and smoke, and it was like the gnarliest, nastiest, scary movie, chaos, war scene. There's explosions. I mean, it sounds scary. So if the Israelites weren't scared and weren't actually awestruck by the power of God and what Moses was doing for them, at this point, they were never going to be awestruck by anything at all. So let's look at 19. Like I said, it had to be scary. And then later in 20, it continues with some of the story. But God shows his trust in Moses. It says that God spoke loud enough for the people to hear it. And he spoke loud enough for the people to hear it to build up their confidence in Moses. To make Moses, once again, that leader. Not just a guy who's taking them on a journey, but no, he's the leader. He is the guy who God speaks to. Not Jim Bob, somebody else in the ranks. Not Johnny, but no, Moses. He's that guy. So God speaks loud enough for everybody to hear it. Moses takes a message from God. He goes back down the mountain, and he gives some very specific directions to the people. Stay back from the mountain. Don't go up the mountain. Even some religious leaders, they can't go up on the mountain. Everybody stay back. What happens if they try to set foot on the mountain? D-U-N, done. They'll die. It's very specific. God said the only other person that Moses could bring with him was Aaron. He said to bring Aaron. In chapter 20, Moses, he again shows his trust in God. And again, each time his trust builds more and more in God. I think at this point, I think earlier in Moses' life, it was like blind faith. Why did he trust God? Well, because you're supposed to. It's like, why do a lot of us trust God? If you say, okay, put it in God's hands. I don't like that term because to me, it's overused. I'll just put it in God's hands. Put it in God's hands. Every time I turn, I'll put it in God's hands. Well, what does that really mean? Well, it means to have blind faith. It means to trust, right? Have some blind faith. At this point, I don't think Moses had blind faith in God. I mean, he'd already seen plagues, Red Sea. He had spoken to God. He had burning bush. All these indicators, all these things that you could see, touch, and feel happen. So no longer was it blind faith that Moses had in God. He had true faith, tested faith. So Moses goes up to the mountain, comes back down with a message for the people. Yeah, 5 minutes, doggone it. And at this point, it's like a movie. Like I said, the smoke, the fire, stones flying, and everything else. Now, he originally had, so we'll simplify this story even more so I can get through, okay? So my apologies. You get whoever's an issue, we can talk to me later about it. But God tells Moses to cut two stones, cut two tablets, and come back out. Because what happened to the first two tablets? Moses destroyed them. I don't know whether he looked back in like hindsight, thinking maybe that wasn't a good idea. Nevertheless, he cuts two stones, goes back up Mount Sinai. God inscribes the law, the commandments with his finger. Moses brings them back down. Now, when in that dialogue where God's talking to Moses, talking loud enough, he's giving the commandments. He's speaking of what's right and wrong, what the law is. Again, so the people could then gain in faith. The people could hear what the message is. The people could have faith in Moses, and Moses' faith in God. So skipping down and way oversimplifying the Ten Commandments, we'll talk about the end of Moses' life. Where did Moses die? Where do you think? If you said the Middle East, you'd be right. Well, Moses died on a place called Mount Nebo. Moses couldn't enter. I mean, Moses is a 120-year-old guy. Yet, the scriptures say in... I lost it. Anyway, the scriptures say that he was a healthy dude. That his eyes weren't weary, that his tongue wasn't weak, his body wasn't weak, and so forth. He was still a healthy man. Yet it was his time to go. Moses, he isn't able to reach the promised land. In Deuteronomy, it talks about he's able to climb up on the mountain. He's given the opportunity to look out on the land, see it with his own eyes, survey it, and then he's done. And then on Mount Nebo, it says that he died. God buried him, and that was the end of Moses. But the people were able to enter the promised land. And so his life, I remember thinking one time, a long time ago, man, what a sad life. You know, all these things have happened to you, and you've put through all these trials and tribulations and dealt with all these junior high kids this whole time, getting them in the promised land, and then you can't enter it yourself. But God never meant for Moses to enter the promised land. God meant to use Moses as that faithful servant to get the people, to lead the people, to create faith in them, so then they can inhabit the promised land and continue with generations and generations and generations of future Israelites being born. Unfortunately, Moses, he didn't enter the promised land because he was unfaithful at that last moment. He was unfaithful in an account just prior to this that then allowed him not to be able to enter the promised land. But I actually think that maybe he wouldn't have been able to anyway, because I don't think he was supposed to. I don't think he was supposed to end that way. I think he was supposed to be that guide, that mentor and coach, and then release his people to go live on their own once they learned how to be able to take care of themselves. Yes, ma'am.
Thought that way too, that, because it says you can't because of this, but if you put before Moses, like you brought up, you can go over here with all these little school kids, or you can come to heaven. Make your choice. I mean, what would you choose?
That's right, exactly. And Moses, I mean, even though he wasn't tired, he was 120 years old, and like I said, his time had come. Hearing voices out there, I'm just going to skip the last slide and say this. Moses, he didn't do everything right. Moses was a guy, and I'm going to step out on a limb and say just like us, because he was flesh and blood. He had doubts. He wasn't sure of himself. He had strengths. He had weaknesses. He was distracted. He had excuses. He was really just like all of us, because we do the same thing. Even though all of us have something great to bring to the table, we do the same thing like Moses did. But Moses was able to overcome those things, and he was able to put God first and put his faith first. And over time, it didn't happen overnight, but over time his faith grew to be able to work for and assist God in what God's intentions for the Israelites were to be. So I know we're out of time. Thank you very much. We could have spent the next 3 or 4 weeks talking about this exact topic, but thank you for the last 40 minutes. So have a great afternoon or day, morning.